Day 12. At this point in the cessation timeline, dopaminergic signaling in the nucleus accumbens has normalized. That sentence requires unpacking, because it's the most important pharmacological fact about what you're experiencing right now. Nicotine works primarily by flooding the nucleus accumbens, the brain's reward processing center, with dopamine. Not the amount that food or conversation or achievement produces. Significantly more. Chronically more. Over time, the brain compensates by downregulating its dopamine receptor sensitivity and by calibrating its reward baseline to the nicotine-elevated level. The consequence is that natural rewards feel insufficient. Food is blunted. Achievements register less. Social pleasure is diminished. At day 12, that calibration has reversed. Natural rewards are generating proportionate dopaminergic responses again. The experience of pleasure from food, from physical activity, from interaction. It's not that these things have changed. Your brain's ability to fully register them has returned. This is not a recovery from withdrawal. This is the restoration of the capacity to feel rewarded by ordinary life. It is the opposite of what nicotine was providing. Hours 265 through 288. At hour 265, tonic dopamine levels in the nucleus accumbens have normalized. Natural rewards produce full-magnitude dopaminergic responses. The clinical notation is exact. Pleasure from everyday activities feels genuine again, not dampened through the filter of an addiction-calibrated reward system. This is the completion of a process that began at day 8. The recalibration is done. At hour 266, alveolar macrophages, the lungs' primary phagocytic immune cells, are recovering their function. These cells had been chronically overwhelmed by the particulate and chemical load of inhaled smoke. Their phagocytic efficiency compromised by the sheer volume of material they had to process. At day 12, that burden is cleared. They are functioning as designed, patrolling the alveolar space, clearing debris, coordinating local immune responses. The lung's primary defense is operational. At hour 267, coronary artery endothelial function is improving measurably. Flow-mediated dilation, the endothelium's ability to dilate a coronary artery in response to increased blood flow demand, is returning toward normal values. This is a clinically significant improvement because impaired coronary endothelial function is both a marker and a driver of coronary artery disease. As it normalizes, the heart's ability to respond to exertion demands improves. The cardiac muscle is receiving better perfusion. At hour 268, secretory IgA levels in mucosal surfaces are normalizing. Secretory IgA is the frontline antibody that protects mucosal surfaces, the lining of your airways, your gut, your oral cavity, from pathogen invasion. Smoking suppresses its production. At day 12, this first line of mucosal defense is being rebuilt. You become more resistant to respiratory infections at the barrier level. At hour 269, keratinocyte proliferation and differentiation rates are normalizing. The skin cell renewal cycle, which smoking had disrupted, is operating at normal speed. The external appearance of recovery follows from this internal normalization. At hour 270, thyroid hormone metabolism is stabilizing. Thiocyanate, a compound found in cigarette smoke, disrupts thyroid function by competing with iodide uptake in the thyroid gland. As thiocyanate clears and thyroid metabolism normalizes, energy regulation becomes more consistent throughout the day. At hour 271, executive function mediated by the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is restored. Decision-making is clearer. The cognitive fog of early withdrawal and the chronic subtle cognitive suppression that smoking produced by occupying prefrontal nicotinic receptors is lifted. At hour 272, leukoplakia and oral mucosal lesions associated with tobacco exposure are beginning to show regression. Abnormal cell growth in the oral cavity, driven by chronic carcinogen exposure, is beginning to normalize as the carcinogen source is removed. At hours 273 and 274, lactate threshold during exercise is rising as oxygen delivery efficiency improves, and systemic markers of oxidative stress, F2-isoprostanes and melandialdehyde, are declining further. The free radical burden that smoking imposed on every cell in your body is continuing to decrease. At hour 275, endogenous acetylcholine production and receptor sensitivity have reached equilibrium. For 12 days, the cholinergic system has been recalibrating without exogenous nicotine disrupting its function. At day 12, that calibration is complete. Concentration and alertness feel organic, not dependent on a stimulant, not diminished by its absence. At hour 276, type 2 pneumocytes are producing pulmonary surfactant at normal rates. Alveolar surface tension is correctly regulated. Gas exchange efficiency in the alveoli is at design specification. At hour 277, plasma homocysteine is dropping. Homocysteine is an independent cardiovascular risk factor. Elevated homocysteine damages endothelial cells and promotes atherosclerosis. Smoking elevates it. At day 12, the level is declining toward normal range. This is a separate cardiovascular risk reduction from the platelet, fibrinogen, and CRP improvements, an additional biochemical mechanism by which cessation protects the heart and blood vessels. At hour 278, neutrophil bactericidal activity is normalized. These first responder immune cells, your body's immediate defense against bacterial infection, are functioning at full efficiency. The immunosuppressive effect of chronic nicotine on neutrophil function is clinically resolved. At hour 279, transepidermal water loss is decreasing as skin barrier function normalizes. The stratum corneum, the outermost skin layer, is functioning as a proper barrier again. Skin hydration is improving not because of topical intervention, but because the underlying cellular infrastructure is restored. At hour 280, hepatic and muscle glycogen storage patterns have normalized as insulin sensitivity has fully recovered. The metabolic roller coaster that nicotine-driven sympathetic hyperactivation maintained, blood glucose swings, energy crashes, is resolved. Afternoon energy is more stable. At hour 281, hippocampal neurogenesis is active. New neuron production in the dentate gyrus, resumed at day 10, is now progressing into maturation. New neurons in the hippocampus support memory consolidation and mood regulation. The process is slow, but it has been running for 48 hours. The neurons forming now are the ones that will support cognitive function over the coming months. At hour 282, olfactory receptor neurons have substantially regenerated. The olfactory epithelium, which undergoes ongoing neurogenesis because olfactory neurons have a relatively short lifespan, is now functioning at or near full capacity. Detection thresholds for odorants are approaching non-smoker sensitivity. The range of perceivable scents is restored. At hour 283, resting cardiac output has normalized. Heart rate and stroke volume have reached their optimal resting equilibrium. The heart is doing exactly what it should do. No more, no less. The chronic overwork imposed by nicotine's sympathetic stimulation is done. At hour 284, the complement cascade, a critical arm of innate immunity that triggers inflammatory amplification, has returned to baseline activity. The immune system is precise again, responding to genuine threats rather than running in a state of chronic smoke-induced activation. At hour 285, elastin degradation has ceased. Smoking activates matrix metalloproteinases, enzymes that break down structural proteins, including elastin, which gives tissues their elasticity. That degradation process has stopped. New elastin synthesis will take months, but the loss has halted. Every day forward is a day not destroying elastin that cannot quickly be replaced. At hours 286 and 287, cortisol diurnal rhythms have restabilized. The hypothalamic, pituitary adrenal axis functioning with proper circadian patterning. FEV1, forced expiratory volume in 1 second, the primary spirometric measure of lung function, has measurably increased from day 1 baseline. The lung function test that would have shown your airways narrowed and obstructed is now showing recovery. The clinical notation at hour 287 is specific. FEV1, forced expiratory volume in 1 second, has measurably increased. Spirometric testing would show improvement that wasn't present at day 1. Let's be precise about what that means. FEV1 is the volume of air you can exhale in the first second of a forced breath. In active smokers, chronic airway inflammation, smooth muscle hyperreactivity, goblet cell hyperplasia, and ciliary dysfunction all combine to narrow the airways and reduce this number. As each of these processes resolves, The inflammation, the goblet cell hyperplasia, the smooth muscle reactivity, the airways become physically more open. The number goes up. At day 12, the combination of reduced airway inflammation, improved ciliary function, normalizing mucus composition, and recovering smooth muscle tone has produced a measurable increase in FEV1 from your day 1 baseline. This is not a feeling. It is a spirometer reading. Mucociliary transport velocity is at approximately 70% of non-smoker values. The mucociliary escalator, the clearance system that smoke had paralyzed, is running. Airways are more open. Breathing during exertion requires less effort. If you've been physically active over these 12 days, you may have noticed this, without being able to name it. The lungs don't announce their recovery. They just work better. Hour 288. 12 days smoke-free. Dopamine receptor sensitivity in the mesolimbic pathway is normalized. FEV1 is measurably improved. Systemic inflammation markers are at or approaching non-smoker baseline across multiple measurements. The coronary arteries are functioning with improved vasomotor tone. Hippocampal neurogenesis is active. Olfactory recovery is complete. Elastin degradation has stopped. 2/3 of the 14-day sprint is complete. The finish line is 2 days away. The physiological case for completing it is built into every system in your body. Day 13 is the penultimate day. The brain's default mode network resets. Blood viscosity is normalized. Cognitive flexibility is fully restored. Carotid intima media thickness progression has halted.